Okay, Emily, Teni, shall we start?
Yeah.
Excellent. Right. Well, we're going to introduce ourselves briefly. So I will introduce myself. My name is Simon Henderson. I am an assistant head teacher and a head of history and head of sixth form at a school in County Durham, and have taught about history and race relations for the last 20 years or so. Emily.
Oh, yeah, thank you. My name is Emily Folorunsho, and I'm currently the head of history at an inner London school. I also do now once a month teacher talk radio, as I am on SLE, as well as a lead practitioner as well.
Hi, my name's Teni. I am a teacher of history at Harris Academy. English is hard. Harris Academy in North London. I've been teaching for a few years, worked on this book with these amazing guys, and I do some stuff with BBC Bitesize as well.
Excellent stuff. So, hello to everybody. It's one of those things where we can't see you, so let's hope that you are there and you are listening and ready for hopefully what will be an informative hour or so. We're going to start with a few pieces of contextual information and a bit of discussion about this resource and where it comes from and why it's being produced. I believe there'll be a poll at some point for you to take part in, and at the end of this session there will be the opportunity to get some free samples, and I believe one lucky person might actually win the entire resource. At least that's what it says on my piece of paper here. So, and there'll be some time at the end for question and answer also. So I'm going to start by asking a question, and then Emily's going to ask a few questions, and Teni, and we'll just kick around a bit of a contextual discussion about this resource and where it comes from and why we've produced it. So the first question is, what does the curriculum look like now? What does a sort of standard Key Stage 3 curriculum look like? And I guess therefore by leading on from that, why therefore is this resource important?
I would start off with, so the Historical Association in 2021, last year, sent out a survey, and it was found that only 23% of the 316 respondents reported teaching a series of lessons on Black and Asian British history, so the key British history, with only just 15% teaching histories of the UK civil rights. So that gives us a key indication in terms of what the current curriculum looks like. So not enough schools, and also including mine, if I'm being honest, teach the UK and British civil rights movement. It's something that we're changing, which I definitely would show later. So although those look like stark statistics, to be honest, I know that there is a hunger and a thirst out there to include Black British histories into our curriculum. So although those statistics are not encouraging, I know, speaking to multiple history HODs or teachers in various schools, there is that desire to implement Black British history. And I think this resource is a good way to build that confidence to get that going.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think those statistics, I think, are a really accurate reflection of like when you move outside of London and you're looking at curriculums like across the country. And I think what we are starting to see is a shift from, I guess, where schools, I think a lot of schools started was like meanwhile elsewhere kind of homework and trying to get kids to maybe, oh, let's go and see what else was happening in the world outside at this time. But I think we're moving from pockets of it to, like the survey said, series of lessons where you're starting to look at Black British, Asian British, like how all of those different demographics make up British history. I think that's something that's being moved towards, but very much not arrived yet. Which I guess leads us on to our next question, which is, why is it crucial that students learn about Black British history?
I think it kind of builds on what Emily and yourself have just touched on, Teni, when you said there that it sometimes it was seen as something which is a bit of an add-on, and actually the title of this webinar is that Black history is British history, and that really is the point. And it's not as though the teaching of Black history is somehow something which is a sort of an add-on or an extra. We're just teaching British history in all its richness, and with a with an appreciation that the demographics of British history, in order to reflect that correctly, it needs to have a fair slice of Black history in there as well. Otherwise, it's not actually the full story. It's not actually British history if it doesn't have some Black history in there. And so that really, I think, is the heart of this resource, that we're trying to integrate Black British history into an existing Key Stage 3 curriculum, so that we see, and students see, that this is part of the history of Britain. It's not something different or an add-on or a separate sort of piece of project work.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I feel like history in its very nature is diverse. So to have those silences whereby, you know, Black and Asian history isn't being represented isn't really good history, because history in its very nature is diverse. And I think by incorporating Black British history, it touches on the idea of, you know, humanism. That's why I fell in love with history, because of the stories of people, and also the agency. So one thing I really love about the resource, it's not a passive form of this is what happened to Black people, but it goes beyond that, and we do really see that sense of agencies. And I just feel like the silences within our curriculum are just as loud as what is actually in the content of it. So if, you know, Black British history is not being incorporated, then it gives that implicit notion of we don't belong, or it gives that implicit notion of actually US civil rights is more important than UK civil rights, or nothing happened here. For so long I thought nothing happened here until, you know, learning about stuff earlier on. And also it provides essential context to allow critical thinking about what Britishness actually means, because it evolves over time. There's no set notion of what Britishness entails. It's ever changing, it's ever evolving. So there's, you know, lots of links to like citizenship as well. And it enables students to understand, you know, why it's really crucial. It enables students to understand the fundamentals of issues of citizenship. You know, we've seen, due to like the Windrush scandals and other scandals of evoking citizenship. So it really does engage students in that critical thinking of that. So yeah. So my question now is, why is it now the right time to start teaching British history, do you think?
I think there's, I guess you can kind of go about that question in two ways, and you can kind of look at the whole Black Lives Matter 2020, but I think that there's a bigger, more academic argument to be made that I think changes to the curriculum have always kind of followed historical scholarship in one way or another. And I think there's been a massive shift in the focus on Black British history, and there's so much literature and scholarship and fiction about the place of Black history in the like British past, and how much and how important it is in the history of the British Isles. So I think that the inclusion of that in the history curriculum is actually quite overdue. So even without the mass movement and the protests and George Floyd and kind of the outcry after that, I feel like the whole excuse of, oh, there's no resources, there's no textbook, there's no work done, I have to do the research, I feel like that became invalid like 10 years ago. Fair enough, I might have still been in school, but I'm pretty sure it was still invalid then. So I think it's now the right time, because all the resources are there to be used. All the research has kind of been done. Like David Olusoga's book, there's a children's version, and there is so much that can be done with all of these things, that I think this resource pack really does just make it 5 times easier to kind of step away from that. I'm going to call it, yeah, an excuse of there's not enough information, or I don't know where to start, I don't know what to do. And yeah.
Yeah, I think Teni is right to mention Black Lives Matter, because I think that in the sort of explosion of the media coverage of that movement in 2020, in the way in which certainly the symbolism of George Floyd's murder in the midst of a pandemic was something that was really powerful. The idea of some guy actually being starved of breath during the middle of a pandemic, in which sadly many people are dying because of a respiratory disease which stops you from being able to breathe. There was something incredibly powerful about that, in terms of the way the media started to engage, I would say, in a way that maybe scholarship had been engaging 10 years before, as Teni talks, or 20 years before. And it sometimes takes popular history and mainstream media time to catch up with what scholars have been doing 10 or 15 years before. So I think that provides a catalyst for some impetus as to why this is important now. But actually, you know, not to be too trite, the time was always right. It's not just the time now, because part of the reason why we get to the need for a Black Lives Matter movement, part of the reason why we have George Floyd, part of the reason why we have so much discourse that's divisive on social media about issues to do with race relations, is precisely because students have not been exposed to a more comprehensive understanding of British history and the place of Black people in that history. And as Emily mentioned before, you know, the connections between a civil right, you know, we all know about Martin Luther King, and we know about the African-American struggle across the Atlantic, but students don't know about sit-ins and boycotts in Bristol. They don't know about the work of civil rights activists in this country. And I think until students have a sense of that, then we are going to have students who grow up to be adults who continue to have a less than comprehensive understanding of British history. And part of that, I guess, sort of, as Emily said, part of that history that has large silences in it is part of the reason why there's so much divisiveness and so much discourse around the conversations about race in the first place. And so the time is right now because of the catalyst of the Black Lives Matter movement, but the time has always been right. And that's how we might have avoided as a society getting to the point that we are now.
I agree. Thank you.
And finally, I guess, and we've all touched on this, why do we think it's really important to integrate Black British history into an existing Key Stage 3 curriculum rather than having it as a kind of a separate study or something that we do during Black History Month?
I think, Emily, you said it perfectly earlier, that like the silences on our curriculum are almost as loud as the things that we include. So it was one of my biggest pet peeves, to be honest, it still is, looking at curriculums and you're going through and it's like, okay, where do we get Black British history? Or you talk to staff and they're like, oh yeah, we teach slavery. And I just sit there.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's the introduction point. That's where kids meet Black people. That's where Black students first see themselves. That's where, when you want to see Black figures in history, they're enslaved. And it's like, well, if that's the one pocket in which they see any form of Black history related to British history, the implications of that can be so damaging for Black students' sense of self, but also for other students' perception of Black British people. And it completely distorts the actual reality of what happened. But if it's properly integrated from their study of Roman Britain to see the diversity in that and threaded through time, they'll get to understand that all of these different facets and demographics and all of these things actually make up part of British history, and they get a real, I guess, inclusive sense that, I guess, like Simon says, we can avoid a lot of the divisive issues that we have to tackle if students can really understand that actually all of these different people all played an equally significant but different part in history over time.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's also the way in which we sequence our curriculum. That has a voice as well for sequencing. So if, for example, we're just doing, Black British history and Black British History Month, or it's a kind of a simply just a meanwhile elsewhere activity, it also fosters that sense of exclusion almost. However, there's nothing wrong with, for example, I've got a scheme of work whereby it's it's a unit on Black British history, which I'll talk about after. So there's nothing wrong in terms of incorporating it, but I think we need to also be mindful of the way that we sequence it. So for example, when we look at the medieval world, we look at 2 case studies, which is Mali, and then next year we'll look at also Baghdad. So that's one way in which we, although that's not Black British history, that's one way in which we do incorporate Black history. So also being mindful of the way we sequence our curriculum, because that helps in terms of the integration as well. And just as Teni said, fostering and weaving the presence of Black people from the Roman times, or all the way to like if your Key Stage 3 curriculum goes into the 60s, then fostering that presence also kind of echoes that sense of integration and that sense of belongingness as well.
I think it's Francesca's just commented in the chat that when she taught about the Black Tudors, that students were genuinely shocked that Black people were not always enslaved as part of history. And I think it's that sort of misconception is so important to challenge, for people to have a better understanding of British history and a richer understanding of it.
I must say as well, like prior to becoming a hard, barristers say, but the first time that anybody saw a Black person in my curriculum was as a slave. And that had to change because that was the first introduction of a Black person in the curriculum, which is quite embarrassing to state, but that was it until this year, whereby in year 7 they look at the Mali Empire. So I'm happy that's changed. That's thanks to Teni because she shared her resources. So I'm happy that's changed. So it's about, you know, how we sequence that presence. I think that's really important.
And I would add that I think I've realized really, like, coincidentally in the last few weeks, that this has such massive ramifications, because I think we underestimate how much of your Key Stage 3 education you remember. In preparing a lesson on like ordinary Victorians the other day, I was just looking at like, oh, who can I pick out from the resource pack? And I think we even were just looking at Georgians, just that period. And I was having a full-blown debate with full-grown adults that there were Black people in Britain, and they were like, no, they're not. And I was like, well, you can't tell me that they weren't, because they were. And this, I feel like the importance of what we're doing can't be understated, because you are really making an impact on people as they get older. Because if you went through school and you never saw anyone apart from, I guess, the traditional white British face in your history studies, unless you went outside or you looked at slavery, that when you're trying to talk to them about famous Black footballers and boxers, and you get grown adults saying, well, no, it really highlights the importance of what we're doing in our curriculum, that there were Black British people that weren't enslaved. And it is a difficult thing in some contexts to have to completely undo, but, you know, we can only try.
Yeah.
So I believe what we're going to do now is we're going to move on and have a look at various different aspects of the resource. So hopefully that contextual discussion has kind of given you an idea of kind of where the resource is coming from and why we produced it. And where we're now going is to try and pick apart what the resource actually does, so that, you know, we've talked about the reason why we wrote what we've written. Now we're just going to talk about what's in that pack and how it might be useful to use, and we're going to take little bits at a time. So I think I'm going to talk first of all about the way in which the resource has been put together chronologically. One of the things I was thinking about when planning this, and you'll see that Unit 6 is Windrush, Arrivals and Reaction. So you can kind of see that from Unit 6 onwards, that's a sort of post-Second World War focus. And there's obviously, again, a bit of a misconception that Black people arrived in Britain on the Windrush, and then it's a kind of post-war phenomenon, Black people migrating to Britain. And so the reason that actually 5 units out of the 9 deal with the presence of Black people in Britain before the Second World War is directly to try and challenge that assumption and that misconception. And although the unit headings there, this is not this doesn't purport to be a narrative of Black British presence from the year dot to now with nothing missed out. It does, I think, touch on the major periods of time, the major thematic issues, and the major chronological presence of British people, Black people in Britain over the last 1,000 years and more. So there is the unit headings you can see there. The actual units, and I think if Rojan moves the slide on, the actual units themselves, the unit guides. So each unit is made up of 5 sections, And within each unit, there are lessons and there are resources, which we'll come on to talk about later. But really, these unit guides provide context for teachers. So something that Teni mentioned before, people who maybe don't feel that comfortable about teaching Black British history, maybe feel a bit under-equipped, a bit underskilled in terms of their knowledge to be able to talk about it. These unit guides provide more context than is needed for the lessons. So there's 5 elements to each unit. You won't need to use all of the information in the unit guides in the lessons that exist, but what they do is provide some good context for teachers so that you can think about some of the broader issues being spoken about in each unit, and you can think about some links between different content. That is a good point. So I've just been reminded that we were going to have a poll, and I got overexcited by the unit guides. So talking about the unit guides, I shouldn't have mentioned that I just got a prompt there, because I could have made it look like I was seamlessly moving into this. So we're going to run a little poll about people's kind of confidence levels in terms of teaching Black British history, how much they teach at the moment, what they think. And I believe that poll is going to run, here it is. How confident are you about teaching Black British history in your school? So I'll pause for 2 minutes whilst you select your level of confidence, with 1 being very low confidence and 10 being high confidence. We can't vote, Emily and Teni, it says that at the bottom.
Oh, such a shame.
I know. So those unit guides, as I was saying, are to provide a little bit of extra for staff and for teachers, but also they're to provide some more depth information for students, because the resource pack is entirely editable once you've got the digital version. It means that you can take, oh, here's the results. So we're on about most people are in the sort of 5 to 7 range, doing some very elementary maths there. So that's good, because then hopefully that means that people have got a certain level of confidence, and we can show you how the resource can be used to maybe take your current level of confidence further. But it also means that those of you who don't feel as confident, hopefully you're going to feel more confident after this. Emily's now going to talk about how you can use the lesson plans to suit your school, and she's going to talk about a little case study of something that she's done with the resource.
Okay, so for example, as we know, teacher workload is a lot. So one of the ways in which, because some of you might not want to, scrap or rebuild a whole curriculum, although I think that's really fun. That's my favorite part of the job. So I know most schools teach a US version of civil rights, so looking at the significance of maybe Martin Luther King, or looking at, what did the civil rights movement in America achieve for African Americans. But it's also great to kind of do a comparative study, whereby you could do a meanwhile nearby task, or kind of meanwhile here task, or whatever. And there's various links within the resource that could cater to that. So if, for example, your current curriculum, you look at the case study of Emmett Till, you can compare that and get students to look at Kelso. I don't know how to pronounce his surname, so I don't want to embarrass myself. Yeah, and they could, use that and look at the similarities and the differences. And what's great about the resource pack is the information to be able to do that task is there. I know most of us do this already, whereby we can compare the Montgomery bus boycott and the Bristol bus boycott, and looking at Martin Luther King's influence, not just in America, but also in Britain, and the impact that he's had on British campaigners. And I put the page numbers within the resource pack there, and also Malcolm X's impact in Britain. And they both did come to Britain and give speeches, and impacted various Black British activists here. So getting students to see actually that their impact wasn't just far-reaching in America, but it was far-reaching across the Atlantic, and also looking at the similarities and also the differences. And what I find really interesting about this, because I teach civil rights for A-level, we look at various groups, is that when we look at women civil rights in America, a lot of their tactics that they used was heavily influenced by the British campaigns like Emmeline Pankhurst and so on. Whereas the US civil rights in America, in the UK civil rights here, was heavily impacted actually by what was going on in America. So I think if we wanted to give that broad understanding of the US civil rights, I think we definitely could incorporate a comparative study of UK civil rights. And you could do that using Meanwhile Elsewhere task, or Nearby task, I should say, or incorporating it into a homework booklet, which we've done here, which has been a lifesaver for those that don't have, computers and stuff at home. Another way in which we are using the resource as well, although the resource has lessons and worksheets and basically everything done for you. So Jamie says, sorry, in the chat, also media coverage of the 1919 race riots in Cardiff and Mississippi, or simply Britain and USA in the context of world events. But yeah, that's precisely it, because I think students don't realize that actually lynching actually occurred here as well, not just in America. So that's a really good point, Jamie. Thank you for sharing. And feel free, anybody else, to share. If you could go to the next slide. So one would be homework task, and another which I got from Nevi Safa, amazing. I just literally developed this even further because her scheme of work was on 4 lessons, but I've just developed it to about 8 and I can't really see it now. So the inquiry question is, what led to the toppling of Colston statue? So because we're moving on to a 3-year Key Stage 3, I've literally got a blank slate with year 9s. And as a bridge, because we our thematic course for Edexcel now, we've changed to migration. So as a bridge from Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4 migration, this is a perfect inquiry, I believe. And we look at a series of factors, and it's basically like using the whole resource pack from the beginning all the way up to the end of the booklet, of the textbook. So we start off with, obviously, slavery as the first factor, and looking at Edward Colston's involvement in the slave trade. Then we look at colonialism as another factor, and the title there is, I can't read it, sorry. And then we look at post-colonialism as a factor. And then we look at activism in the UK, police brutality, institutional racism, looking at the case study of Stephen Lawrence, which is in the textbook, and also looking at and then for homework they look at the case of Mark Duggan, which I remember in 2011. Then we look at the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK and USA, and then they've got their assessment prep lesson. So we look at a multiple of those factors, and what I like about this is that it starts off from like the 1500s all the way up to present day. So it's almost like that thematic study, because we need to get our students at Key Stage 4 thinking in a thematical way. So it's literally going all the way from slavery all the way to like 2011 and so on in 2020, and really truly from this, students should see that Black British people feel very tired due to kind of mixture of all those factors and the interlinking between all those factors. And it also ties in really well with the discipline of history, because if you could go on to the next slide, when we do the assessment prep lesson, we look at all those factors, and our aim is to get students to assign each of those factors to a causation word to build their casual reasoning. So for example, they would maybe assign slavery as a factor to the foundation or the root of Colston's toppling, and maybe the Black Lives Matter campaign, or as like a trigger almost, or as a short-term cause. So this is really kind of in line with the discipline of history and development of students' casual reasoning. And I'm happy to send those. It's still early days because it's a blank canvas with year 9s, but I'm really excited to teach that, and the resource has been a huge help in terms of creating that kind of mini thematic study. Yeah.
So I'm going to talk to you guys about the lesson PowerPoints and the worksheet. So Emily and Simon so far have done a great job of explaining, like, I guess the bulk that comes with the unit guides that I think would massively ease any kind of nervousness or anxiousness or hesitancy to encounter these new topics, because it's literally all there for you. Emily's shown a great way of how it can be integrated and expanded to create whole new streams of work, or even homework booklets where maybe you're not in a position to do a whole curriculum or partial curriculum overhaul. But in introducing them, I guess, on a more intricate, I don't know if that's the word, level, it also comes with PowerPoints and worksheets. So it's not just that you've got the unit guide to figure out what content you can include, but each unit has 5 guides. And then alongside the 5 guides, it comes with 3 lessons. So there will be content that doesn't necessarily have a lesson attached. It might be content that goes better with a scheme of work you already have, or it might be content that might help you weave in key figures or people or smaller events into lessons you already have. But there's also 3 whole lessons that come with a lesson plan and a worksheet for each one. So for example, here in Unit 3, there is a unit guide on the sacking of Benin City. So it gives students the context that they need. It gives them an introduction into how the narrative has changed over time. So sometimes it's kind of known as the sacking of Benin City, sometimes it's known as a massacre, but it culminates in students understanding why the Benin bronzes are where they are. So this is just an example of an activation slide. So each lesson is structured using a connection, activation, demonstration, consolidation. Even if your school doesn't do it that way, if that's not how you plan your lessons, they're all digital, it's completely adaptable. But what it does give you is sources, quotes, key questions, and all of those questions, if you then follow the worksheet, direct you back to the unit guide or resources that are included in the pack. So in looking for activities, if you're not sure how to frame certain parts of the unit guide or certain content, and you're not sure necessarily how you would deliver it, each lesson starts with a connection, which is kind of like the traditional hook of the lesson. So with this one, they're given a quote describing Benin City, and they're asked to figure out, where was this city? Why do you think it was where it was? So they are framed as really rigorous and interesting lessons, so that you don't have to worry about, oh, it's a new topic, is it going to be to the same standards as everything else? Because we've given you something that I guess we've all seen and tried on from our own experience would flow really well with a strong history curriculum as it is. And then each lesson is kind of set out with different tasks. So for example, if you look at task 2, read the first 2 parts of section 3.3 of the unit guide and then answer the following questions. So you can then direct yourself back to that unit guide. You have access to it. You have access to the full section. You have access to all of 3.3. So if you want to scaffold it down, if you want to reword the language to suit your class, this is why it being digital is so helpful and works in lots of different settings, because in some schools, reading huge chunks is normal, it's part of everyday lessons and they're really accustomed to it. Your school might not quite be there yet, might not quite, you know what I mean, might not be there yet, but you can scaffold that down to suit what works for your kids, or it might just be that you read it to them. So yeah, every lesson comes with one of these, and hopefully, again, like Emily mentioned earlier, teacher workload is mad. So there are so many ways in which hopefully this teacher resource pack makes it really easy for you to start putting this into your curriculum in an effective way, but one that doesn't give you loads of work.
Okay, so moving on to model answers and videos. Essentially, when we kind of thought about this to start off with as a product, it was going to be a textbook. But then lockdown happened, and we started exploring, all of us, I think, as teachers, different ways of trying to engage students as a result of the pandemic and students being away from school. So then we started to think, okay, so it's going to be a digital pack rather than maybe just a sort of standard traditional piece of text that you can hold in your hand. You get that as well, but you get the digital download as well. So one of the things that is incorporated within the resource is a number of digital resources that you get access to once you've got the hard copy of the resource, and then you've got your code to download. So what's in there are some model answers and some videos. So essentially, the resource is built in terms of the assessment tasks around some key historical skills that students need to use, whether they are in Key Stage 3, 4, 5, undergraduate, the kind of 4 pillars of historical study in terms of the skills that you need. So it's the ability to construct an argument and explain why something happened when it did, the ability to evaluate the utility of primary sources, the ability to evaluate an assertion and test it based on own knowledge, and also the ability to evaluate an interpretation of the past and to make a judgment about how convincing or how valid that interpretation is. So the assessment tasks that, again, are included in the pack. So there's an assessment task for each of the units, but there's also a model answer. And sometimes the model answer is an actual physical written out answer that's in the resource pack. Sometimes it's a digital model answer, like the ones that there's screenshots from it being displayed on the screen here. And these videos basically last for about between about 9 and 13 minutes, and they essentially talk students through how to complete a model question. So they are doing some modeling for you. Now, you could use that by just simply pressing play and putting your feet up and let the model answer talk the students through. You could mute it and you could just use actually the graphics and you could talk over it yourself. You can, one of the things that I've started experimenting with using the resource in the last week or so is you could QR code these model answers and you can put them in a homework booklet, or you can put them alongside an assessment the students are going to do, and then they can use the QR code, watch the model answer on their phone before they have a go at doing the real thing. Or you know, with the actual written out model answers, you could just take half the model answer and only give them half and say, okay, then in the style of how the model answer has started off, can you complete that answer based on the work that you've done? So, you know, there are many different ways. There are 27 lessons in this pack because there are 9 units, and there are 3 lessons per unit. But actually, if you include the assessment tasks and the model answers, there's scope for many more adaptations of this resource, the likes of which Emily's shown you in the scheme of work that she's produced, so that you could use these in a variety of different ways. Okay, so moving on.
So in terms of the assessment tasks, yeah, I think the hard work has been done. You don't have to think of an assessment unless you want to. The great thing about this is that there's a teach guide and model answers are provided. And the questions that are posed as part of the assessment are very kind of integral to the discipline of history, whether it's evaluating an assertion or evaluating historical views, evidential thinking, causation, interpretations, all of that. And source work is included in this resource and as an assessment task, which is great for building and enabling Key Stage 3 students to transition into Key Stage 4 as well as Key Stage 5. But as I'm preparing for the migration unit, there's aspects in this book that are really useful as well for Key Stage 4 migration, for those that might you know, teach that. And it also mitigates any worry about creating a wrong question or language, because I know sometimes when we're teaching sensitive topics or schemes of work, it might be a worry for some teachers. Is this a right question to ask, or have I used the appropriate language here? So I think it mitigates any of those worries. So please do check out those assessment tasks. Yeah. Oh, Teni, you're on mute.
Knew that. I was just testing you guys, obviously. So yeah, using oral histories and interviews with historians, enriching the teaching of the content. Oh, that felt like a throwback to online teaching, just talking on mute to myself. So yeah, I think one of the best things about this pack is that it comes with videos and conversations with historians, with people in the field, with people who are specialists in this and really have a passion about it, which comes to life with the video. Because I often feel like I love a good video. I love something that brings it to life maybe a bit more than just me reading or just, question comprehension. And I think sometimes, like Emily said, with the assessments, we can worry about the wording and the language, and are we communicating like the appropriate level of agency for these people in these periods of time? Are we doing things of this service? And I think where there's fillers and opportunities to give the floor to historians who have studied it and have that level of knowledge, I think that can really, really enrich the teaching of the content. And even if you're not necessarily using these videos for your students, I think, as I guess as like a form of CPD, it can be really helpful just to have the access to these resources, to hear what the conversations are, what is the current historiography saying, how can you enrich your knowledge beyond the unit guide. So this is a clip of one particular historian talking about the Haitian Revolution and the significance of women. And the guide doesn't necessarily go into that avenue in loads of detail, but this video really gives you a sense of the importance of women in that revolution. So if you wanted to take the lesson in that direction, you do have, I guess, the kind of door into that topic or that area, and it gives you just lots of little opportunities and directions to take all of these different topics in. So it's not just this unit guide, this unit guide, this unit guide, but everything is really deeply interweaved with so many connections. With like the Haitian Revolution, you can connect it to the French Revolution. Where else have you studied French history? Where does European history fit? Why does the Haitian Revolution then have anything to do with Black British history? And all of those webs and links and connections are really exciting and really get brought to life by these oral histories, which Simon did a phenomenal job of finding everybody and recording some really great interviews.
And can I just state with that, like, I think when we look at decolonization, we think about the content only, but it's also what material and who are we introducing to students in terms of historians. So the fact that, the resource and Simon's, you got a diverse range of historians, not just white historians, but also Black voices, Black historians. I think that's phenomenal. We don't just want to introduce our students to kind of a Western perspective of history in itself. So that's something to think about when trying to maybe decolonize your curriculum, and think about in terms of diversity, not just the content of diversity, but the content of those historians, and also literature in terms of sources as well, because with sources, it's not just written sources. You could have Kente as sources and African proverbs as sources. So it's a mixed bag. So yeah, Simon did an excellent job with gathering the historians.
Right, I believe now we're moving on to time for questions. That means we need to open up the chat so we can see. So if you have any questions, then feel free to ask your question and we will try and answer them to the best of our ability. Yes, and you can add them in the chat or the question and answer function, as it says in the chat there. So the first question is, how have your students reacted to these lessons or topics? Well, I think it's probably fair to say that with Emily and Teni teaching in London, that their classrooms are probably more diverse places than my classroom in Little Barnard Castle in relatively rural County Durham. And I think the thing that stuck with me actually is one comment from a student that stuck with me quite early on when I was developing this part of this resource, and I was teaching some year 10 students actually about the Notting Hill, about Notting Hill in general, but this particular lesson was about the Notting Hill Carnival and Notting Hill as a site of protest for Black people. And one student at the end of the lesson just said, "We've never looked at anything like this before." And then she paused and she said, "But we really should have, shouldn't we?" And for me, that was kind of the whole reason for creating the resource in the first place, in the sense that somebody who had no cultural frame of reference actually for the Notting Hill Carnival, had never been to Notting Hill, didn't really understand that part of Britain and British history existed. For that student to recognize that was really important and that she should have learned about that, and it was really significant, for me was like really the best reaction that I could have had from that lesson.
Yeah, I think I'd really build on what Simon says, because I think there's so much that, like, you kind of assume that students get the implications when you say things like, if you don't teach this history, they think this, or if you do teach that history, then they think that. But teaching my students the other day, we were just about to, when we started our year 7 with Roman Britain, so I got to use a lot of the Ivory Bangle lady stuff and how diverse Roman Britain was. And we used a cartoon of the Ivory Bangle lady with some of the text from the unit guide. And when I put the picture up on the board, one of them said, "Why is she black?" And I was like, right, okay, we haven't even got to the task yet. And I was like, well, read the information. And then they read through it and they were like, well, how is she from Africa? That doesn't make sense. Then the first question is, oh, was she a slave? And it was really eye-opening to see how quickly they made clear all of the assumptions that we thought they had about their curriculum and we thought they kind of get from popular history, and to see how, I guess, real and entrenched they were. But they were so engaged with being able to see how diverse Britain was so long ago. And then, because I've been working with the year 7 curriculum this year, and to see how that's played into the rest of the course, just their language has changed, their understanding has changed. They're no longer shocked when they see diverse faces in different places. Like, it's no longer like, oh my goodness to them. It's almost an expectation to some degree, which I think is really great that this resource pack can have such an impact so early on in the curriculum.
See a little note there in the chat, not just to highlight the fact that it's somebody saying nice things about me doing the videos, but Jamie Baker, who's put in the chat there, Jamie is actually one of the people who is given one of the explanations in the video, and Jamie does an amazing job of explaining the significance of the race riots in Cardiff after the First World War. So you're going to say nice things about me, Jamie. I'm going to say nice things about you as well. So we've got another question here with MPs like Kemi Badenoch talking about the dangers of critical race theory, speaking out against the British Black Lives Matter movement. Are you worried about where the government will go with the national curriculum in the future? Take it away, Emily.
Yeah, definitely. When I was building upon the work of Nefi in terms of why why was basically Edward Colston's statue toppled, I was really worried about, does it seem like I'm promoting an agenda here, or that idea of critical race and also the Black Lives Matter movement, because not everybody is a big fan of the Black Lives Matter movement. However, at the end of the day, it does center what I do like about the book, the resource, as well as the inquiry that I'm building, is that it centers history in the present day. It centers it in the current situation. So if we miss that out, if we don't explore these issues, then it's just like students won't have an understanding of what's going on. And especially what I notice about my Black students, for example, is that institutional racism, for example, is very nuanced. It's really hard to pinpoint, when without studying examples of that taking place, for example, the Stephen Lawrence case and police stop and searches and stuff like that, I don't think they're really prepared for the real world. And despite that, Black British history isn't just centered in activism either, or in terms of racism either, because what I do like about, from the first chapter all the way to the end, is that we see that race actually was constructed. It wasn't kind of like a, when I say race, I mean like the society's notion of race wasn't necessarily a biological means, if that makes sense. Of course, I'm Black and whatever, that's the biology, but the kind of adjectives or the ideas attached to that's very much constructed. So yeah, I am a bit worried. So in essence, to that question, I am a bit worried about Kemi's ideas about critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter movement. But until, I guess, somebody might say I can't, I'm still gonna teach it. And even if they say I can't, I'll still try to interweave it somehow and somewhere. So yeah, and it's not it's not a political ideology, it's just history, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd second that. I would probably argue back to someone like Kemi to say we're teaching about British history. This is what Britain looked like. This is why Britain is as it is now. It's not an agenda any more than teaching about any other aspect of British history is linked to an agenda. It's actually linked to telling the complete story, and telling the complete story helps us to have a better understanding of the society in which we live now. That is the point of history, and that is the point as historians, to try and tell the story in all its richness, in all its successes and failures, so that we can understand where we are now. We have another question here about Miranda Kaufman's book has a good range of individuals other than Blanca. Is there a range of individuals that are from the Victorian era that we should expect our students to know? Sancho, Seacole are well known, but are there any others? Well, yeah, there are actually. One lesson focuses a lot on Celestine Edwards and Catherine Impey. So that Celestine Edwards and Catherine Impey, a black guy and a white woman, who both worked tirelessly in the Victorian period to challenge notions of caste and racial difference. So there are lots of examples of different voices and different stories in there that are not necessarily the traditional stories that I guess pop up in Black History Month, or pop up in mainstream books that tend to highlight the same people over and over again.
Yeah, and there is a in the unit guide, I think it's I'm gonna say unit 3, don't quote me. In the guide there is one about Black business and enterprise, and I think there's 2 or 3 examples of Black industrialists in the Victorian era, which is one thing that I think fits with what you guys were saying about if we were going to talk about Kemi's response to, you know, teaching Black lives, Black history, which is British history. One thing the resource pack does do is it is really just history. It's not got a political agenda. The agenda is to show that Black history is British history, which I think in its most simple and genuine form has no deep political agenda, and I don't think requires challenging from any MP. So I would continue until, like Emily said, I was told not to.
I think there's a question there. Are the sessions throughout each year group teaching, or do you take a part of the term? And then I think it's Rachel said, oh, sorry, I think you've answered that. Well, actually, it's still a pertinent question, because there's many ways you can use this resource. In the introduction to the resource, it shows that what you could actually do is you could take those 27 lessons that exist, and you can sprinkle them and integrate them into an existing Key Stage 3 curriculum. So you might have something there in year 7, something there in year 7, 3 down here in year 8, something there in year 9. Or if you want to do it in a different way, then you can look at it thematically, and the kind of the way that Emily has. Certainly in my own teaching with year 9, we've done a lot about the First World War and the interwar years. And now, having done that, we're exploring the role of Black people in those years. So it's integrated, or you can do as kind of like a little separate thing, whichever you way. The beauty of the resource is it's very, very, very flexible, and you can use it however you want.
Yeah, I would always I think that both is always really great. Like, I think having those topics and those units where you're looking explicitly at the role of Black soldiers in World War I, or like the Black UK civil rights as a topic, to see its significance just in and of itself, just with its own authentic value, is really powerful. But I think if that's then coupled with sprinkling it through the year, so it's not like, oh, we've got to the summer term, now we do the fun history, and now we're going to learn about this people, but to move away from that and actually just see it as part of history. And the same way, I guess when you're looking at including more women in your curriculum, you might have one unit on women's rights over time, but throughout all your lessons, you'll want to highlight the role of women in different places in history. I think the principle is exactly the same. And like Simon said, the resource is so flexible that I think it really does allow for that.
Do you have any reading recommendations, Emily? I think that was the question. Either students or teachers. Other than the resource itself, of course.
Yeah, I have loads. So for example, I definitely would say Akala's Natives. That's really useful, especially for the stop and search element within the resource, if you couple that with it. Also, there's a textbook out about the slave trade in Bristol with Rich Kennett and Sally Vaughan and so many people, so many of the Bristol historians, and that's really good. And you can use that alongside this textbook, and that's what I've used for the first lesson for Edward Colston scheme of work, and looking at the fact of his involvement in slavery, because he was actually from Bristol. So that's a really good resource. There's actually an article from the Historical Association, which is History Teaching 185, and that touches on the UK civil rights movement. So look, if you read that teaching history article, that's really good, and it gives further ideas about how to incorporate the UK civil rights movement into the curriculum. That would be great. Yeah, I'm not too sure. Apart from that, I don't know if anybody else has got anything.
Quite comprehensive, Emily. We've got time for one more question if anyone's.
Oh, with the book, I would add the children's version of David Oladehin's Black and British. I mentioned it earlier because the adult one, of course, I've read it from cover to cover, but the kids one is super accessible and really easy to use in a classroom. So I think, especially if you were looking for like reading for students, I think, and there's a lot of overlap with the resource pack in terms of topics because it does cover similar-ish time periods. So that might be a nice supplementary reading for them.
Yeah.
Anyone poised on their keyboard thinking, shall I?
I did see a question up here on, I think it was from Rachel Colvin. It says, no, Mel, sorry. Mel Davis. So she says, apart from John Blanc, what other significant individuals pre-20th century, Middle Ages onwards would you expect students to be taught about and know of?
Yeah, I think I touched on Edward, on Celestine Edwards and Catherine Impey, and I think there are lots of people that don't appear in traditional textbooks that are dotted throughout the resource.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Right, well, thanks very much for all of you who are out there, hopefully listening. And thanks to Emily and Teni, obviously. And so it's goodbye from me.
Bye everyone, thank you.
Bye, thanks for coming.